दोस्तों, स्विफ्ट ट्रेंडिंग पर आज हमारे साथ एक बहुत ही खास मेहमान जुड़ गए हैं बर्तानिया से। नाम है जॉश प्रोवन या जोशुआ प्रोवन। और आप अंग्रेज हैं, आप लेखक हैं और काफी मशहूर किताबें आपने लिखी हैं। तीन का तो मैं गिनवा ही सकता हूं। वाइल्ड ईस्ट, द ब्रिटिश इन जापान, ये एक बड़ी मशहूर किताब है, 1854 टू 1868। उसके बाद उनकी दूसरी किताब आई बुलक्स ग्रेन एंड गुड मदीरा। ये मराठा और जाट कैंपेन्स ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी के उस पर ये किताब आधारित है। इनकी तीसरी किताब है एवरी हैजर्ड एंड फटीग। और एक और किताब वो लिख रहे हैं और आने वाले वक्त में और भी ये किताबें लिखेंगे। आज हमारे साथ एक खास मौजू पे बात करने के लिए जुड़े हैं आप, टीपू सुल्तान। जी हां, शेर मैसूर टीपू सुल्तान की शहादत की एनिवर्सरी हुई है अभी हाल में। 4 मई 1799 को ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी की फौजों के साथ लड़ते हुए उन्होंने अपनी शहादत दी। और हर साल 4 मई को हम उन पर बात करते हैं। हिंदुस्तान में भी उनका आजकल उर्स मनाया जाता है। क्या यादें हैं टीपू सुल्तान की अंग्रेजों के दरमियान? आज जॉश प्रोवन से हम ये गुफ्तगू करेंगे। ये गुफ्तगू अंग्रेजी में होने वाली है। Ladies and gentlemen, I have with me a very special guest from England. His name is Joshua Provan. He is a very well-known writer and he has written 3 books already and more are in the offing. His first book, Wild East, The British in Japan, got a lot of critical acclaim. His second book, Bullocks, Grain and Good Madeira, The Maratha and Jat Campaigns of the East India Company, that has also got very good reviews. His latest book is called Every Hazard and Fatigue, and a fourth one is in the offing as well. We have invited him to speak about Tipu Sultan. Yes, the Mysore ruler Tipu Sultan, who fell fighting the English East India Company's forces on the 4th of May 1799 in Sringapatnam, his capital city. Every year on the 4th of May, his martyrdom is celebrated in parts of India. But what does it mean for the English, for us in North America? Josh Provan is going to tell us. Let's welcome him right away. Josh, thank you so much for joining us.
I'm glad to be here, Manny. Thank you for inviting me.
You know, Tipu Sultan is this iconic figure. He's quite an enigma of sorts. For the English even today, there are exhibitions, there are auctions that are held every now and then where they sell something related to Tipu Sultan for millions of pounds. But it's been centuries since he passed, and yet people don't seem to forget. We haven't had enough of him, it seems. So what are your thoughts on this, since you live in the UK and you probably know what the buzz is like over there?
I think that because Tipu became a strangely central figure in the story of the British Empire, he's never particularly been out of some portion of someone's mind over here. He would be the story of the Tiger of Mysore was a legend that probably most schoolboys ended up learning during the 19th and early 20th century. And certainly anybody who had any dealings with the administration of India would certainly have known about him. And he was sort of like a common factoids. He was sort of like, yes, he was sort of like one of those things that educated people would know about. To give some examples, today, I wouldn't say that he is as well known as perhaps he once was, but as you say, he's still certainly a known figure. And especially if and especially in London and across the south, where a lot of his possessions reside, you can do a tour across most of the large museums of London and you will find artifacts there relating to Tipu Sultan. And it's quite fun to try and spot them, actually, when I take people around. And I'll explain to them. Obviously, the Victoria and Albert Museum has the tiger. And But most places have some of his swords or little bits and pieces that somehow filtered out of private hands into these larger collections. And of course, in Wales, you have Powys Castle with the Clive collection, where the majority of it ended up, at least the stuff that's on display. So already, even if it's subconscious now, he forms a great deal, a very large part of consciousness in terms of legacy and history.
Mhm.
And you also have, as I was saying before, that this sort of fact that he was sort of like something that educated people would know about and talk about and write about. And there's a book or a diary, I've forgotten exactly who wrote it, of a lady who was shown the governor's residence in, I believe it was Delhi. And one of the things that she pointed out when she remembered this was actually quite late on, and it might have actually been one of the women associated with Mountbatten, actually, but she referred to the throne of evil old Tipu that was on display in one of the main rooms as
Mhm.
a particular focus point. And this idea of the evil old Tipu, the bogeyman that the British had to destroy in
Mhm.
order for them to establish themselves in India, is a core part of the British identity through the imperial period. And therefore, it's inescapable not to know about Tipu if you care anything about British history and certainly colonial history.
Mhm.
And there's an interesting parallel with America, actually, in this sense, not only because Tipu was known to the founding fathers, but in the sense of how you celebrate the big enemy you managed to defeat, like the
Yeah.
Romans and Carthage and things like that. Well, the Americans put the death of the Shawnee leader Tecumseh in the Capitol building, and the British celebrated the death of Tipu in a similar way with iconic paintings and novels and stories and some songs as well. So I think that he's a very integral part of a part of British identity that today people struggle with.
And I see that even modern fiction in some ways remembers Tipu Sultan. Sharp's Tiger, for instance, is not a very old novel that way. But then it also projects Tipu Sultan as this monster, as this evil that had to be taken down by the British. And I would say that's very colonial in its mindset, that particular novel. But that continues to inspire a lot of people, at least art and fiction in the UK. So it's not that a more neutral image of Tipu has emerged in the UK. It is still inspired by all those old colonial tropes, don't you think?
I think it is, yes. It was such a there's an old there's a quote from an old Western I think it's about the man who shot Liberty Valance, which goes something along the lines of um, yeah, when truth becomes legend, print the legend.
Mm.
And the legend of the evil Raja with his infamous dungeons and torture chambers on his island palace and his obsession with tigers and things like that became a stock character practically that was too, I don't know, too vivid to just throw away. And that is what that was what got passed down. There
Mhm.
were very few people sympathetic to Tipu, unfortunately, to help maintain a kind of a balance, certainly in Britain anyway. And it wasn't helped at all by Bernard Cornwell
Mm.
and the Sharp series, which was incredibly, popular. And it
Yes.
had TV movies made out of it and things like that. And
Yes.
it just so happens that he inserts his hero Sharp into all the high points of the Anglo-Mysore Wars, including, I think, I don't remember, does he actually kill Tipu or is it that he
Yes, I think so. I think he's part of at least the detachment that kills Tipu, if not
yeah.
personally. Yes.
So, and in fairness, I suppose he's trying to give some sort of a contemporary feel to how a British sergeant would have felt about an Indian ruler. But it doesn't quite help because people just sort of continue to accept that this was what he was. And I too, when I first read about Tipu, in biographies of the Duke of Wellington,
Mm.
I got a very negative appraisal of him because all that anybody really, even historians, will tell you they'll replay the stories of General Baird and the
Yes.
people who were captured at Pollilure and stuff like that, and they will not go at all into his wider life, and that is why we have this generally, I think, yes, negative opinion in uh, England about Tipu, unless you happen to be someone who specializes or reads a lot about Anglo-Indian history.
Hmm. But and yet there is a lot of mystique about the life and times of Tipu Sultan. In fact, I have read contemporary accounts, and there is one example when Ram Mohan Roy, Raja Ram Mohan Roy, goes to England. He visits Bristol, and then there is a crowd waiting to greet him. And the crowd is very curious because this man has come from the land of, quote, Tipu Sahib. So they wanted to see this gentleman who had come from the land of Tipu Sahib. So he was a somebody that the British were certainly curious about. The British folk, the common folk, they're very curious about him. And of course, we can't say that in a positive way. Maybe they wanted to see a guy who has come from the land where this great villain has emerged or was or had lived. So that way also maybe it sparked some curiosity. But curiosity nevertheless. Tipu Sultan or Tipu Sahib to so many Englishmen back then, he did arouse a lot of curiosity. So have you encountered cases like that while doing research? And in what way do you think things have changed over time?
I think that the curiosity is what allows people to interact with the real or the authentic Tipu rather than the legend of Tipu. Because once you start reading about him, it's impossible to maintain the legend. He could be cruel, yes. He
Yeah.
wasn't particularly friendly to enemies who fell into his hands, but so were a lot of other people in India who got off with somewhat better reputations. But I also think you had a very good point there a second ago when you were talking about that curiosity. And just because someone is a villain doesn't mean you don't sort of respect him. And I
Mm.
think that the British made such a big deal about Tipu was because they did sort of respect his prowess, his danger. He was the main focus of anti-British sentiment in India for a while. And that that travels through this sort of sneaking admiration for the fallen foe kind of thing. In fact, they sort of almost eulogize him in some senses, in a way that wouldn't have happened if he had just lived a long and healthy life as a friend of the British. And so what you get is if you ever meet anybody who knows anything about him, you'll usually encounter the old stereotype. Um, some people are just very enthusiastic about him as a sort of a popular, as a sort of just popular currency, the tiger guy, the guy who has all the tiger stuff, which people
Right.
enjoy a lot. And I think that is sort of again, an approachable point. Oh, he had a very strong brand, as they would say nowadays, and that helps as well. And I think that one of the other things, of course, is that Britain is a very multicultural country nowadays, although some people would prefer that it wasn't. And Tipu has therefore now many more friends in this country than he had in the 1850s, so to speak, and more people who understand where he came from and who grew up with stories about Tipu in a completely different context to what people like myself did. So I think that things are slowly changing, partly because of the academic need to decolonize history, to
Right.
be open about what the British Empire was and its in its entirety, the good, the bad, and the ugly, so to speak. And therefore, Tipu now, I think, is slowly moving out of the old pantomime villain routine into something that is more real. But a lot more work needs to be done, and with people's attention spans diminishing, even a lot of work needs to be done to keep him in the discussion, especially in England.
Right. But in India, we also have discussions around Tipu Sultan, and these are not often friendly. In fact, Tipu is seen as and projected as this cartoon villain whose only objective in life was to kill Hindus and other minorities. And this is a new image of Tipu Sultan that has been crafted in post colonial India and more so in the last 20 years or so. We have seen the celebration of the life of Tipu Sultan leading to conflict in the Indian state of Karnataka. People have been booked for carrying photographs and posters of Tipu Sultan by Hindutva groups. They often complain that Hindu sentiments have been hurt because you brandished a photograph of the Mysore ruler. According to them, he was anti-Hindu. And now that the Hindutva politics has taken center stage in India, it has become increasingly possible to erase any kind of positive memory that Tipu Sultan had or positive feeling that he evoked. So now we have Tipu Sultan as this permanent villain in Indian history. So a positive conversation, or let's say a more well-rounded conversation about Tipu Sultan is no longer possible in India, perhaps. But do you see some hope that in other parts of the world this could still be possible?
I do, and it is a great irony that it might be that it is in Britain where you can have that conversation, given they were his great rivals and the people who killed him. Um, but that is the way history works sometimes in a sort of a strange poetry. I by happenstance I was in a restaurant I think 2 years ago, and the people sitting next to me they were originally from Pakistan, and it was a mother and her daughter, and I talked to the mother for quite a while about Tipu, and it was a very favorable discussion, and she saw him as a tragic hero. Um, but then again, that might also speak to the difference between how he is seen in Pakistan and how he is seen in India. And that in itself drags us down a different road that would take a very long time to to get off. But yes, I do think there is hope for a nuanced view of Tipu that is no longer the British cartoon and is not either the cartoon of the modern Hindu nationalists in India, because, as I've said to you before, Tipu has almost led many lives, and it's fascinating to see how his legacy has changed over the years from being rehabilitated from the British view by the independence movement and Indian historians who rightly claimed him as a resistance fighter, um, to what it is now, which is a very antagonistic and partisan uh, tool almost of repression in some cases, I believe. So uh, I think that in other parts of the world, yes, we can do a lot of good work trying to get beyond those stereotypes. But at the same time, those stereotypes have been reborn in a very surprising place, especially given that the reality of Tipu as a ruler in India, I mean, these were pluralistic societies. If you ruled a kingdom in India, you couldn't be specifically anti one thing or another without being overthrown very quickly. And you wouldn't need the British to do it if that was your goal. Um, he was, as I said before, Tipu was not all that different from other Indian rulers at the time who would be cruel or benign depending on the political or military circumstances before them, and this was not unusual. The difference being with Tipu and his father, um, is that he was a direct enemy of the British.
Yeah.
And so their reputation suffered from the fact that the British felt they needed to remove them. So that's a bit of a rambling way of saying that it's just observing the irony of how you can now have a more nuanced view of Tipu outside of India
Right.
than once was the case.
You mentioned the irony, and of course, it is quite stark when it comes to India because you mentioned early on in our conversation that the history is going to be or is increasingly getting decolonized, and therefore the image of Tipu Sultan is getting rescued in some way in Britain and elsewhere, but not so in India, where colonial tropes and colonial stereotypes are being pushed in the name of decolonization, where you have permanent heroes and villains. So, as you mentioned, that India was a pluralistic society and no ruler could afford to rule by antagonizing one community or another. But it seems that is the general image that is painted nowadays in India that, well, if they were Muslim rulers and they were evil, they were always against Hindus and others. And Hindu kings were benevolent and nice guys, real heroes who fought against Muslim invasions. And the British are never really talked about as enemies or as foreign powers. So that's a tragedy that we are facing in India. But it is ironic for sure that a country that actually celebrated the memory of Tipu Sultan in 1999, which was the bicentenary of his martyrdom, has completely turned around to say that, look, he was a great villain of our history, and there's no need to remember him or honor him as an Indian hero. So I wanted you to comment on it because you live outside of India and you watch us from a distance. But how do you see when how do you feel when you see this sort of an irony unfolding in India?
Well, there is an initial sort of amusement, uh, as all good ironies are quite amusing in their way, and especially for a British person who sort of expects to be the villain of the piece
Mhm.
when it comes to India, seeing people all too willing to turn on someone who should legitimately be seen as the hero in terms of the British and India. Even though even that is a generalization beyond sort of authentic reality because history is far more nuanced than all just good guys and bad guys. But then there is also I feel a bit of a sadness, a little bit of a disappointment in that as well, because it is a sad thing that his legacy is being so attacked and being so used for vile purposes and politicization that I would think most Indian rulers of his age would be quite confused by. And it is, yes, I think it is a sort of a disappointment that this should be the case for history in India. I don't want to preach to people. It's not my country. And I don't understand the politics as well as people who live there. And I'm sure they all feel that they have their reasons for blackening Tipu's name and using it to further their causes. This is what happens with history across the world. But because I can see that, because I can see people using historical figures for their own ends, where even when there's no basis for it, it makes me rather rather sad, a little disappointed that this is the case, especially with a figure like Tipu, because, as you said, um, an Indian ruler, whether or not they came to power, whether or not they were a new power like Muslim Mysore was, or they were a established power like the Mughals, or a semi-new power of one of the galaxy of states that came out of the fall of the Mughal Empire like the Marathas, all of these people, they weren't just all Muslims and they weren't all just, Hindus. The allegiances were quite different back then, quite different to the European system as well to some extent, where it actually mattered more whether you were a Catholic or a Protestant than where you came from. In India at that time, it was somewhat different, and it's a shame that that's sort of being lost. And I think a lot of the troubles that beset India at this time, in terms of unrest and anti-Muslim sentiment, doesn't need to be there. And you could unite around people and figures like Tipu, because frankly, and the British are the bad guys. It's been established the British were the bad. Mostly, if you're going to characterize it in this form, the British were the bad guys. You have the enemy
Mm.
right there. You don't really need to find your own people to do this. Tipu was born in India. Islam was an established religion throughout India for a very long time, and he absolutely deserves his legacy deserves better than what it is currently being subjected to. Even though, of course, his life is very complicated and textured, and he wasn't always good and he wasn't always bad, but that's the point.
Yes, he was capable of amazing grace and amazing cruelty at the same time. And we have a lot of people to attest this, a lot of contemporaries who visited him or who met him. And then they testify that he was capable of amazing kindness. And we see this in the case of a British officer's wife who visits the Sultan and asks for her husband's release because he's in the dungeons of the Sultan in his capital. And he not only agrees to release her husband, but also gifts her a portrait of himself, which he carries with her all the way back to England, and which still survives, I think, in the family possessions of that person. Their descendants, they still keep it. So I also think personally, I want you to comment on this, that personally I think Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan were really different rulers of their time because they were the first to identify the British as an existential threat to Indian royalty. They thought that if the British are not checked, then no independent power is going to remain in the subcontinent. So that way, I think they were very modern in their thinking. And at a time when other Indian rulers did not see the British as permanent adversaries, the Mysore under Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan never allied themselves with the British. They always used the French against the British. They took their help, but never from the English. That way, they were very dedicated in their hatred of their British, very uncompromising when it came to fighting the British. Do you see any examples like that elsewhere? Or do you think Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan are unique in that regard?
No, I don't think that there are many examples out there of people being as foresighted as Hyder and Tipu were. Especially Hyder, because Tipu inherited some of his antagonism of the British from his father. Um, the rest of the Indian kingdoms, the major Indian kingdoms, Hyderabad, the Marathas, the last of the Mughal possessions, and things like that, they had well, I mean, for a start, the Marathas basically controlled the emperor for quite a while anyway. But well, if we use them as the example, they to be fair to them, they did their best to stay away from the British for quite a long time. However, they were drawn into wars against Mysore as a British ally because the British had this rather nifty knack of forming coalitions against Hyder and his son. And I couldn't say whether or not it was simply because of the circumstances that placed Hyder and Tipu as direct enemies of the British that made them wake up so quickly to recognize that the threat to me is a threat to everybody else. Um, but either way, it is indeed a foresighted, a far-sighted view of what was happening in India at a time when the British were being more or less treated as just any other sort of local power who had come in and was now something to deal with. The rulers of Mysore, the Muslim rulers of Mysore, saw them as something that, yes, you could deal with them, but it would be much easier if we put them back in the position they were under Aurangzeb.
Mm.
So this this attitude obviously ended up creating the circumstances for their downfall as well, because of course nobody particularly liked the new regime in Mysore, unfortunately. Hyderabad was deeply suspicious of it, the Marathas too, and there was constant fighting between these three powers. Except for a very slight golden moment when Hyder almost managed to gather everybody together, if not in alliance, just in directing them against the British. That was the point where it actually looked like they might actually manage to drive the British back at least to Madras. Um, so I think this is a very important part of their legacy that you bring up, that they saw a different future for India, an India where they the kingdoms would be able to progress in a more leisurely fashion and
Mm.
choose how they did so. Um, this question, obviously a question that came up during the heyday of the in quote unquote Raj,
Mm.
of the sovereignty of the in quotes Indian princes and their place in the empire and the great in quotes imperial family and all that sort of thing.
Mm.
Um, and a lot of people would have argued back then, as they do to some extent now, as a legacy of that, that India was able to progress in the way it progressed because of British forcing everybody to unify and stop fighting each other, kind of thing. But that is to accept that point of view is to ignore, for instance, how Europe developed as a series as sovereign nations and kingdoms and developed in conjunction with each other. What India might have looked like had Hyder and Tipu succeeded in driving, or at least restricting them, because of course they had no navy and the French are unreliable allies. But the had they succeeded in doing that, it's difficult to say what India would have looked like, and how it might have progressed on a more equal footing with the European powers.
Mm. And finally, Josh, there would be no Duke of Wellington without Tipu Sultan. Now, this is a statement that I'm making, but do you think there's some truth to it? Because he was untested pretty much. Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington, when he is sent to Mysore. Of course, he was a brother of the Governor General, so that way there were some advantages, but the battlefield gives you different lessons, which no amount of connections can make for you. So he gets injured fighting Tipu Sultan, and he's in fact there at the fall of Tipu Sultan. He in fact assumes the administration in Mysore for a short period after Tipu Sultan dies until the new warrior ruler takes over. So he gets tested in Mysore, and that experience comes in handy when he fights Napoleon at Waterloo, and even before that during the Peninsular Campaign as well. Do you think that would be a wrong statement to make, that the Battle of Waterloo was won in the killing fields of Mysore and not in the playing fields of Eton?
No, I don't think that's the wrong statement. I think that um, the Battle of Waterloo was absolutely won, and I actually say this in the book about the Maratha Wars. So it's practically the last sentence. That it wasn't one of the playing fields of Eton, but it was one on the something like the famine-haunted plains of Deccan.
Okay.
Now, I
Uh,
use
I,
the word.
I write this line in a chapter of a book that is unfinished pretty much, that I wrote, started writing at least when I was still in India. But this is pretty much the title of that chapter. I thought I would just,
Exactly.
I thought I would just test my hypothesis with you.
No, it's absolutely true. Think about Wellington's career. He his most up to Waterloo, he fights the Peninsular War.
Mhm.
a famously arid place, difficult to supply troops in,
Mhm.
that has no um, friendly central government that can adequately support him. He has to do a lot of work to keep troops alive
Mhm.
in Spain. He's working a lot with allies, people who don't speak his language. He's working in against a redoubtable enemy who is very flexible and maneuverable. I believe he is on record as actually saying that he knew as much about soldiering as he ever did when he left India.
Mhm.
And you can see the attention to detail that he puts into everything he does in Spain is foreshadowed completely by what he does when he gets command in Mysore and what he does in the Maratha campaign
Mhm.
to eventually lead him to the Battle of Assaye.
Yeah.
Mysore itself was an amazing opportunity for a young officer on the make. It was one of the only formal sieges that the British undertook in India, where you take time and you dig trenches and you approach things and you build batteries and you cut the city off from all sides. It was against It was against Tipu, and across they had to march across the country to get to I'm going to murder this pronunciation. I'm so sorry, but Srirangapatna or something like that.
Yes, Srirangapatna or Srirangapatnam, both are fine, I think. The British call it Seringapatam, though.
No,
You're not
I'm
doing
trying.
that.
I'm
Thank
making
goodness.
an effort. I'm making an effort not to say Seringapatam. But
Good
but
job.
but thank you very much.
Yeah.
But the all of these things formed his attitude to war, how he had to account for every grain in a soldier's knapsack, how his constant need to be self-sufficient in the face of the enemy, so he could make the decisions he wanted to make, and clearly his. It's a shame we don't know more about what he thought about Tipu, because to be honest, he was a relatively junior officer.
Yes, he was a colonel.
Yeah, he was given a fair amount of responsibility, and of course, he had a very bad time at Sultan Petta Tope.
Yes, he was hit by a rocket and he
Yes.
injured his thigh. Yes.
Yeah, and he got badly trounced in the night by Tipu's rockets and sepoys. The only field action you can actually properly show as he lost is there in front of Mysore. And I don't think it's something he ever forgot. But I also think that just as we're just to tie like to go back to the very beginning and the legacy of Tipu and how he was seen by the British at the time and then later, Wellesley was one of these people. Wellington was one of these people who knew about Tipu as a contemporary. He heard the stories. He knew General Baird. He didn't like General Baird, but he knew General Baird, so he knew about the prisons and the dungeons and all this sort of thing. He knew the fact that the British no longer had any interest in trying to make peace with Mysore. They wanted to remove them just as much as Tipu wanted to remove the British. They knew, and he knew that there was a vague chance that the French were going to try and use him as a tool to mess with them in South Asia. And there's a that respect I was talking about by contemporaries for Tipu, you can see in Wellesley and to some extent the way he treats the household when he takes over, and
Mm.
that he pays for that he organizes the restoration of some of the murals,
Yes.
which depict British defeats. And his governance there was seen as relatively fair.
That mural survives largely because of the restoration work that Wellington did back in the
Yes,
day. Yeah.
absolutely. So you can see there that he was impressed by Tipu and he respected him as a soldier, probably, and as a man, as a ruler. Um, and so much of Wellington's career, even up to Waterloo, traces back to India and those formative years where he was his first taste of command, where he was chasing Dundiya
Yes.
around the countryside and things like that. He was training his troops to march 3 miles an hour figuring out how to keep them alive in the heat and the trying times and things like that. So no, I think you're completely right. The Battle of Waterloo is won in the killing fields of India, not the playing fields of Eton. And he says at the Battle of Waterloo, supposedly, now I will show him Napoleon, how a general of sepoys defends a position,
Yes.
because Napoleon famously dismissed Wellington as just a sepoy general.
Yes.
And I rather think that Wellington wished he had some of those sturdy native infantry and cavalry battalions with him at Waterloo, to be honest. I think they'd have done him proud.
Of course. And at least their swords would not have broken down like they did the English cavalry.
No, absolutely.
Because Wellington had this comment to make about the Indian troopers' cavalry blades, that those were sturdier than what the English troops were using. And at Waterloo, we know that many of those lightsabers, the pattern 1796 lightsabers, had broken down. The heavy cavalry sword had also broken down, so many of them at Waterloo. And the English really struggled with that. So probably at least one thing would have gotten straight if he had his Indian troops with
If
him.
he'd only have had his cavalry at the very least, I think he'd have had a much better time of it. He famously had a liking for South Asian blades. And if you go to Apsley House, you can see quite a lot of Shamshir type and Tulwar
Yes.
swords in his collection. The sword that he had made, specifically the one he carried at Waterloo, is a fusion of a British sword, a Persian sword, and an Indian sword.
Well, that shows what kind of man he was and how the India experience actually did him good.
Yes, I mean, I even believe that his old regiments had very fond recollections of Wellesley Sahib. Um, I cannot, for the life of me, remember how it goes, but there was some celebrations in some of his old Indian regiments when they heard about Waterloo, and some sort of sentiment that they knew he could do it. Of course, he could beat Napoleon. He was our guy.
Yes, even when he became the British Prime Minister, I think his soldiers, some of them would have remembered him. Yeah, even though I have not done any research into that, but I think many Indian Army regiments that participated in the Mysore Wars still carry the battle honor Srirangapatnam. And yes, I have actually seen a battle honor myself at an Indian Army regimental mess. And these are considered to be repugnant honors, so Indian Army doesn't really, nobody wears them in public, in ceremonials, but they're there at the battle honors, as battle honors in their messes. So,
It's Mysore and Asai are the two.
yes, I've seen an Asai standard as well.
The elephant.
Elephant, yes, absolutely. Yes, and they proudly wear them, the Indian Army. Of course, they don't get into the politics behind it that you are not supposed to really celebrate them because these were against other Indians. That's why they are called repugnant honors. You don't officially wear them, but they still have their pride of place in the regimental messes of various Indian Army regiments. Yeah, even today. But Josh, it's always a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you so much for making time for our show. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. I love talking about Tipu, and I love talking with you, my friend. So anytime.
थैंक यू वेरी मच। दोस्तों, जोशुआ प्रोवन लेखक हैं और बर्तानिया से हैं और हमारे साथ टीपू सुल्तान पर, उनकी याद पर आज बात कर रहे थे। अगले एपिसोड में मिलते हैं। अपना बहुत ख्याल रखिए।